Hey guys, today I'll show you a science fiction thriller TV series named The Man in the High Castle, Season 2. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Previously, on last season, Juliana put Joe on the cargo ship bound for Mexico, while she was locked up by the Resistance for failing to kill Joe and helping him escape. The Resistance leader named Gary approached her and said they needed that film, but she gave it to the Nazis. Juliana replied that she had seen the film and could describe every frame verbally. Nonetheless, Gary shot her without hormone mercy. On the other side, with Ed's arrest, Frank approached the Japanese Inspector Kido, pleading to save Ed. Frank insisted that Ed was innocent and that he was the real culprit for the assassination of the Japanese prince. However, Kido responded that Ed had already confessed and he should accept this outcome. Despite Frank's desperate pleas, saying that he deserved to die, Kido turned and walked away. Due to the escalating tensions between Germany and Japan, the Japanese general arrived in San Francisco. He summoned Kido to inquire about the progress in the investigation of the prince's assassination attempt. Kido replied that the investigation was still ongoing, without mentioning Ed's name. In New York, John's wife Helen heard the sound of cars outside and quickly grabbed a gun, looking out the window. She relaxed upon seeing John get out of the car. John told her that his superior had been imprisoned, but that he had accomplices in Berlin. He then took the gun from Helen's hand. Meanwhile, Joe tried to radio John, but found himself on a pirate ship. Though the crew wasn't part of the Resistance, they were ruthless criminals. The crew wanted to sell the film to the Resistance for $50,000. In a critical moment, Joe told them that the Resistance couldn't afford the film and that he would sell it to the Nazis for $200,000 each. This offer was too tempting for the crew to resist, so they agreed. In San Francisco, the Japanese general held a meeting, announcing that Hitler was ill and that his subordinates were eager to attack Japan. He mentioned they now had Heisenberg device data, and once it was operational, it had to reach New York. The attendees applauded, but the Japanese trade minister, Tagomi, grew more serious. After leaving the meeting room, Kido stopped Tagomi, asking him why he looked troubled since this was what he wanted. Tagomi replied that he hoped to maintain peace between Germany and Japan through this means, because in a nuclear war, no one could claim victory. Back with Joe, the crew received an airdrop. Opening the crates, they found them full of money, making the crew ecstatic. After Joe boarded a plane to New York, the crew discovered another layer in the crates. Pulling it open, they found a time bomb. The bomb exploded, destroying the entire ship. When Joe arrived in New York, he confronted John that he had promised to pay those people, but why he had to kill them. John coldly replied that they were criminals and intended to kill Joe. At this moment, Joe's resolve wavered. He began to question everything he had done and just wanted to be an honest, good person. Juliana's stepfather came to Frank's place, asking why they guys left in such a hurry yesterday and what happened. Frank told him that Juliana had already left. He then called him a traitor for working for the Japanese government and spying on his own people, and he even got his daughter killed. Her stepfather denied causing his daughter's death and said he knew about Ed's situation through surveillance. Frank pleaded for his help to rescue his co-worker Ed. However, Juliana's stepfather, now filled with self-doubt after his failed attempt to save his daughter, advised Frank to stay out of Ed's troubles. He then suggested finding a Japanese person who had connections. Frank then approached the antique shop owner, Robert, telling him a friend of his has been arrested for attempting to assassinate the crown prince. He was beaten into a confession, and they found a gun on him, showing that the bullets in that gun were bought from his antique shop. Robert panicked, and he quickly closed his shop. Frank continued to push him to use his connections for the escape, or they were both finished. Elsewhere, Juliana woke up to see a bespectacled man. It turned out the gun had shot a tranquilizer. The man then gave her a tour of his base, which was filled with films from various time periods. He introduced himself as a film producer and said he was actually the man in the high castle. He then asked Juliana to describe the film's contents. Meanwhile, John arrived in Berlin and handed over the film. Watching Hitler's trembling hands as he took the film, John realized Hitler didn't have much time left. Hitler began watching the film. After watching the film, Hitler was in disbelief and angrily wrecked the room. Concurrently, Juliana started describing it to the man in the high castle. She said she had never seen such a desolate scene. It was in San Francisco, filled with ruins. She recognized the Golden Gate Bridge and the shadows of victims, like charred marks. It was like the end of the world. The man in the high castle asked Juliana which characters appeared in the film. She truthfully replied that the resistance member Frank was shot by Joe. There was someone else familiar, but she didn't remember who. The man in the high castle explained that each film reflects their world, close to reality, but different. The world depicted in the film could also happen in their world, which is why Hitler wants these films. He then showed Juliana another reel. In this one, a man lay dead in the street. The man in the high castle asked if she recognized him. Juliana said she saw in the film that the man was killed by Nazis. He's a Nazi. She wasn't entirely sure who the man was, but he looked familiar. The man in the high castle said if they can't identify this man, they are doomed. In every film where the Japanese win the war, San Francisco is eventually obliterated by an atomic bomb, except this one. In this film, the man dies as a Nazi in an alley. If they find him, they can prevent that from happening. Juliana asked if she appeared in the film, but the man in the high castle was reluctant to reveal too much. Just then, Gary shot Juliana with another tranquilizer, knocking her out. Elsewhere, Hitler summoned John and gave him an ultimatum to find the man in the high castle or risk losing everything. Frank and Robert sought help from a wealthy lawyer they knew, who happened to be a big shot. At the door, they noticed two gang members. Robert met the wealthy businessman who happened to be a lawyer and hoped he could defend Ed. But the lawyer said it's a case involving the Crown Prince's assassination, and he didn't want any part of it. Seeing the lawyer was unwilling to help, Frank pointed out the necklace he bought for $80,000 is a fake, and he made it. Robert, realizing Frank was betraying him, was taken aback. Juliana was being driven away by the resistance when she woke up and jumped out of the trunk, unfortunately right next to a Japanese checkpoint. As Gary tried to run her over, Japanese soldiers intervened and stopped him. As Juliana tried to escape, the soldiers opened fire. The resistance leader Gary shot and killed two soldiers, but when he turned around, he saw that Karen had been fatally shot. Juliana seized the moment to escape and hitched a ride with a kind stranger. The gunfire quickly attracted the attention of the gendarmerie, who deduced from the bullets and trajectories that there had been infighting within the resistance. Meanwhile, Lemuel and Gary broke into Juliana's house, waiting for her return. Tensions flared due to Karen's death, leading to an argument. After discovering he'd been deceived, the wealthy lawyer took Frank and Robert to the gang's turf. Without hesitation, the gang boss punched Frank. As they were about to execute him, Frank declared he deceived the lawyer to prove he could make them a lot of money. Robert added that Frank is an artistic genius, and he had many clients willing to buy American antiques. Hearing that Frank's counterfeit goods were worth $80,000, the gang boss was intrigued, realizing Frank was practically a cash cow. Frank then set a condition. He needed Ed as his assistant. On another front, enriched uranium for building the nuclear bomb was to be transferred to a warehouse. To avoid Nazi detection, it needed to be moved by bus. The general ordered Tagomi to handle it quickly. Tagomi was concerned about the radiation exposure to civilians on the bus. His subordinate assured him that only buses without Japanese passengers would be used, but Tagomi was still troubled by the prospect. The gang boss reached out to Kido, reminding him of the valuable information he had previously provided about the real assassin. Now he wanted to call in that favor and demanded Ed's release. Kido was reluctant to do that, saying if he was dealing with the Nazis, he was a traitor. But the gang boss didn't care and insisted that Kido release Ed. Lemuel and Gary continued waiting at Juliana's house. Meanwhile, the driver who had helped Juliana arrived with a message for Frank. Gary, pretending to be Frank, took the letter, which instructed them to meet at a specific location at 4 p.m. Gary and Lemuel went to the meeting place, but realized they had been tricked when Juliana didn't show up. After an investigation, Kido discovered that the dead woman was Karen, a member of the resistance. From the description of the woman who escaped, Kido deduced that it was Juliana. Juliana was at her mother's house, flipping through old family photo albums. On one page, she recognized the man from the film. She asked her mother who he was. Her mother replied that the man was George, her half-sister's biological father. George knew he had a daughter, but her stepfather was unaware of this fact. Juliana had left home after discovering the truth. When her stepfather returned, her mother begged Juliana not to tell him. Juliana asked if her mother knew where George was now. Her mother said he was in Brooklyn. After her stepfather arrived, Juliana warned them both to leave San Francisco immediately, as it might be wiped out by a nuclear bomb. Just then, Gary and his companion found them. Seeing Juliana was in trouble, her stepfather hurriedly gave her some money and told her to escape through the air raid shelter. As she was entering, Gary and his partner spotted her and gave chase. Using her agility, Juliana managed to escape from the shelter. In New York, Joe was at home drinking beer and watching TV when John came to see him. John informed Joe that the Reich minister Martin wanted to meet him, revealing that Martin was Joe's father. Joe asked why now, and if it wasn't just another ploy to use him in Berlin. John threatened to revoke his orders if Joe didn't go, and also mentioned that a female resistance member was killed in the Pacific States last night, awaiting confirmation if it was Juliana. Elsewhere, Kido confronted Ed, telling him that even if he confessed, Frank, his grandfather, and everyone at the factory would be killed. Ed was devastated and said if he had known they wouldn't be spared, he would rather die with dignity. Kido then shifted his tone, asking how much Ed was willing to sacrifice for them and suggested he go undercover in the gang. Juliana found Tagomi and told him she was in trouble, requesting a diplomatic visa to leave the Pacific States and do the right thing. Tagomi regretfully refused her request. Juliana bowed and left, then wrote a letter to Frank in a phone booth, urging him to leave San Francisco immediately. Meanwhile, Kido fabricated evidence, framing Karen as the assassin of the Crown Prince. Frank and Ed reunited, and Juliana's mother confessed to her husband about the biological father of Juliana's half-sister. Meanwhile, Juliana found herself cornered again and resolutely headed to the German consulate. Japanese soldiers, recognizing her from the wanted poster, pursued her. German soldiers, sensing trouble, raised their guns. Amidst the tense standoff, Juliana knelt at the consulate's boundary and pleaded that she had worked with Joe and she needed asylum. In New York, a doctor met with John to discuss the euthanasia of John's son, Thomas. Despite John's ruthless efficiency at work, he couldn't bring himself to kill his son. He rubbed the back of his head and begged the doctor for more time. The doctor warned that concealing Thomas's diagnosis was treasonous and that he hadn't reported it only because of their family connection. If Thomas wasn't euthanized that day, the doctor would be forced to report it. After the doctor left, John stood there, lost in thought, realizing he couldn't save his son this time. Joe arrived in Berlin and met his father, Reich Minister Martin. Joe harbored resentment towards the father who abandoned him, responding with veiled hostility to every comment. Martin invited Joe to a family gathering that evening, and Joe reluctantly agreed. Frank showed Ed the letter Juliana had left for him, but neither of them knew where she had gone. Frank speculated that Juliana might have gone to find Joe and mentioned the streets being full of Japanese soldiers, which made him very anxious. Despite his worries, Frank had to honor the deal they made with the gang, which required them to pay money at regular intervals to avoid being killed. Frank and Robert planned to make cufflinks like the ones worn during Lincoln's assassination. The workshop was set up at Robert's house. When Frank went home to get tools, he discovered that Japanese soldiers were searching his place. At that moment, Lemuel appeared and took Frank to a temporary hideout. Lemuel accused Juliana of betraying the resistance by causing Karen's death and letting Joe go, showing Frank photos of Juliana at the German consulate. This infuriated Frank even more, and he blamed their troubles on the resistance's film. The resistance leader, Gary, argued that they were all fighting for freedom against the Japanese and Nazis, and he brought up Frank's sister and her children, which further distressed Frank. Gary accused Frank of being selfish, causing Frank to storm out in anger. At the German consulate, Juliana underwent a thorough examination, as the Nazis placed great importance on physical fitness and bloodline, which would determine her eligibility for German citizenship. She was interrogated by Nazi personnel and revealed recent events and the names of several resistance members. John interrupted, stating that all the people she had named were already dead, and asked if she could provide any living contacts. Juliana denied having any live intel. Despite threats from subordinates to hand her over to the Gestapo, John granted Juliana temporary asylum and made her a German citizen. On the way, Juliana wanted to see Joe, but he was currently in Berlin and unavailable. John gave Juliana a new identity and residence. He also tried to extract information about the mysterious High Castle man, but Juliana remained tight-lipped. Once at her new place, Helen showed Juliana around. Meanwhile, the general confronted Tagomi because Tagomi had refused to use buses to transport enriched uranium. Tagomi argued that using public buses would expose women and children to lethal radiation. The general coldly replied that these were American women and children, not Japanese, and emphasized that Tagomi should not question orders, but simply obey. Despite his moral objections, Tagomi had no choice but to comply. That evening, Joe attended a lavish party. A man approached him and praised his actions on a cargo ship. Joe, already upset about the massacre of people on the ship, grew even angrier and decided to leave the party. As he left, he told his father that he won't forget what he did to his mother. Just as he was leaving, a lady approached him, asking for a light. She mentioned that Joe's father was one of the most powerful men in the Reich and could give him anything he wanted. Joe replied that he didn't want anything his father had to offer. The lady then drove off in a luxurious car. Back in San Francisco, Frank was working on the cufflinks when Robert handed him a card with the Resistance's emblem. The back of the card had a meeting address, time, and a name. At the meeting place, a Japanese-American named Sarah arrived. She's also a Resistance member. She informed Frank that 2 Japanese policemen had been killed during Juliana's defection, prompting brutal reprisals from the Kempeitai, who were now killing people indiscriminately. 12 people were about to be executed, and if Frank wanted to save them, he needed to pick her up in 5 minutes. She left him with a set of keys. The Japanese were randomly capturing people in the factory. Sarah and Frank drove to the vicinity of the factory. Sarah instructed Frank to stay in the car while Gary used Sarah as a hostage to distract the Japanese. Meanwhile, resistance members appeared from behind and killed 2 Japanese soldiers. The 3 quickly got into the car, planning to drive away in a bus. However, the keys were still on the dead Japanese soldiers. As they searched for the keys, a Japanese soldier pointed a gun at Sarah's head, threatening the resistance members to drop their weapons. At the critical moment, Frank seized the opportunity and shot the Japanese soldier dead. These gunshots signified Frank's official entry into the resistance organization. In New York, John and his son Thomas went fishing together, with John contemplating euthanizing his son. Thomas shared his life with his father, mentioning that he had a girl he liked. Hearing this, John fell deeper into contemplation. How could he bring himself to do it when his son was just beginning to have a beautiful life and future? Back in the city, John called a doctor, but not to report euthanizing his son. Instead, he intended to kill the doctor to cover his tracks. He managed to inject the euthanasia drug into the doctor, eliminating the threat to his son's safety. On the other side, Tagomi started meditating again with his wife's photo. With the sound of a falling picture frame, his subordinate entered the room, only to find Tagomi missing. On the floor was a shattered photo album. It turns out Tagomi had once again traveled through time. Upon opening his eyes, he found himself in another world, back at home. In this world, his wife had not died, but soon he returned to the office. After killing the Japanese soldier, Frank did not feel fear. Instead, he felt a sense of freedom and, for the first time, the pride of standing tall, which he thoroughly enjoyed. In Berlin, Joe found his father and expressed his desire to go home. Despite Martin's attempts to brainwash him, Joe remained unmoved. Seeing that Joe still resented him for allegedly abandoning their family, Martin revealed that he didn't abandon him and his mother, who left him instead and burned his letters and didn't answer his calls. After hearing his father's explanation, Joe still turned and walked away. The Japanese general saw that the resistance group wanted to escalate matters, so he decided to give them what they wanted by sending a few infantrymen to the factory to kill some people. Kido hesitated and wanted to oppose the plan, but was overruled by the general. Tagomi showed the general photos of Washington after being bombed by an atomic bomb, hoping the general would reconsider the idea of going to war with Germany. However, the general accused Tagomi of sympathizing with Americans and harshly reprimanded him, saying that if their leader knew, he would kill them. He then ordered Tagomi to leave with the photos. While his subordinate was packing the photos, Tagomi noticed that the burn on his wrist was similar to the burns on the corpses in the photos, making him ponder the connection. With only 6 days left to pay the gang, Frank and Ed went out to find materials needed to make cufflinks. They approached a Jewish hardware store owner, hoping he could help them get some gold, promising to pay him in a week. Seeing his hesitation, Frank lied, saying the cufflinks already had a buyer, so there was no need to worry about the money. Hearing this, the store owner agreed. After he left, Ed commented that the store owner was a good man with kids and that they shouldn't involve him. Suddenly, they heard gunshots. Rushing over to check, they found that the military police were killing civilians as a form of Japanese retaliation, a message to the resistance. Back at their hideout, Frank relayed the news to Gary. The group felt they needed to do something to retaliate against the Japanese. Gary responded they wanted to make the Japanese feel unsafe, and now they had. But they were just a few people and couldn't fight the military head-on. Gary continued, saying that they need to bring down the Japanese Empire through fear. Once the Japanese are scared, they'll act blindly and fear will spread. Frank asked what fear could change. Gary said fear could change everything. Once they are scared, they will turn on each other. That's how they can bring down the Japanese. Hearing Gary's words, Frank temporarily suppressed his anger. As Joe was preparing to return to New York, the same lady approached him, suggesting he leverage his father's high status and power. However, Joe harbored deep resentment towards his father for abandoning him, and he had no intention of staying in Berlin. In New York, Juliana visited John's house to study for the ACT with Helen. Passing the ACT was necessary to obtain permanent residency in Germany. Unfortunately, the deceased doctor's wife also came to John's house that day, seeking solace from Helen. As a result, Helen's tutoring duties were passed on to Thomas. During the session, Juliana noticed Thomas's hands shaking badly. After the lesson, the doctor's wife left, and Thomas remarked he had just seen the doctor last week and now he's gone, which made Helen pause and think. After leaving, Juliana used a public phone to investigate George, who had died in an alley in the film. Meanwhile, Gary asked Frank to help with a mission due to his skillfulness. There was a 2,000-pound bomb from 1945 in a basement guarded by Japanese soldiers. Gary wanted Frank to extract the explosives and turn them into a bomb. Frank agreed, but insisted on bringing Ed along. However, Ed was solely focused on paying off the gang, while Frank was driven by a desire for revenge against the Japanese. The group reviewed the bomb's schematics and learned it had a 5mm steel shell and a core filled with crystalline fuel. Any mistake could be fatal. Driven by revenge, Frank decided to proceed despite the danger. They infiltrated the basement, and the operation was tense, with everyone holding their breath. Juliana tracked down George's address, but learned from the new tenant that George had moved out months ago. She left her number and walked away, but a stranger started following her. Realizing the danger, Juliana hurried off, with the stranger in pursuit. Despite trying to blend into the crowd, she was discovered but managed to escape after a gunfight. Meanwhile, Frank successfully extracted several containers of crystalline fuel using a pump. Ed urged Frank to leave the rest to others and return with him, but Frank was determined to complete the mission first. Helen suspected her husband John had killed the doctor. As a friend of the doctor, she found this hard to accept. Seeing no other option, John revealed that their son had an incurable disease. If the doctor reported it to the authorities, not only would their son be executed, but the whole family would be punished for not reporting it. Helen was devastated, but John reassured her that he wouldn't let that happen and that the doctor's death had to remain a secret. Helen understood that John had killed the doctor out of necessity to protect their son, who was more important than anyone else. Juliana returned to her apartment, pondering who wanted her dead. The phone rang, and the caller told her to look out the window. Outside, a man introduced himself as George. In San Francisco, Tagomi smiled with joy, clearly elated to see his wife. He began meditating again and traveled to the parallel world. Upon arriving at his home in this alternate reality, he was thrilled at the prospect of seeing his wife. However, when he opened the door, she said he had embarrassed her, leaving Tagomi confused. Everything in the house felt new and distinctly American, unlike Japan. The most surprising thing was a divorce petition on the table, indicating that in this world, he wasn't a good husband. In New York, Juliana met George in the park. George, also a member of the resistance, initially believed Juliana had defected to Germany and was now working for the Nazis. He emphasized that John was a thoroughly evil man and that keeping Juliana in Germany had to serve some ulterior motive. Juliana insisted she wasn't a traitor and revealed that in the film, San Francisco was destroyed by an atomic bomb, and George appeared in it. Uncertain about the connection, she came to New York to prevent San Francisco's destruction. George chose to trust her and dispersed the resistance members sent to assassinate Juliana. Turning to Joe, he was determined to return to New York when his father Martin approached him, urging him to visit a certain place. They arrived at an abandoned nursing home, originally built by Jews before the war, and later converted into a brothel for the empire's elite, also known as the Source of Life. It was a place where Hitler aimed to breed a perfect race, with children of the purest German blood raised as killing machines for the empire. Martin revealed that Joe was actually born there and kidnapped to the U.S. the following year in August. Attempts were made to retrieve him, but his mother's decision to take him away was deemed correct, as the methods were too cruel. Joe was shaken by the revelation that everything about his life, even his origins, was a lie. He struggled to accept the truth and teetered on the brink of collapse. After an internal struggle, Joe accepted his lineage, and Martin's words swayed him from returning to New York. Joe followed his father back to their home in Berlin. Meanwhile, Inspector Kido discovered Juliana was in New York, under their commander John's personal protection, which puzzled them. They wondered what was so important about Juliana that warranted such high-level protection. Juliana and George met again, with George warning her that her current residence was under Nazi surveillance. He spoke bluntly, stating that the resistance wanted to kill her for her actions, but was offering her a chance for redemption, to get close to John's family and their friends. If she failed to comply, the assassination attempts would continue. Inspector Keto arrived in New York to request Juliana's extradition from John, accusing her of killing two of their operatives and meeting the man in the high castle before defecting. This caught John's attention, as he aimed to use Juliana to locate the man in the high castle. Naturally, John refused the extradition request, sensing that the Inspector Keto had ulterior motives beyond Juliana. The scene shifted to Keto leaving John's office, with John instructing his men to erase all records of their meeting, indicating a secret deal had been struck. In the parallel world, Tagomi walked through the protest-filled streets of San Francisco. This parallel world faced a Cuban Missile Crisis due to the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, prompting protests against nuclear weapons. Tagomi entered a bookstore and found a book about World War II. The book detailed Berlin's fall, Japan's atomic bombing, the Axis powers' defeat, and the Japanese emperor's signing of the surrender. Keto's man approached Ed, reminding him that they spared him and Frank, hoping he would be useful. With a payment to the gang due in a few days, they demanded all details and conversations be reported. In New York, Juliana accepted John's dinner invitation, both parties having ulterior motives. Under threat from the resistance, Juliana aimed to get close to John's family, while John sought to build a relationship with Juliana to extract the mysterious film producer's location. Elsewhere, the man in the high castle burned most of the films at his base, sparing only a few of the most critical reels. He then drove away, leaving the smoldering remains behind. Tagomi returned home with a heavy heart. In this world, his son was still alive, but seemed to hold little regard for him, accusing Tagomi of bringing shame to their family. The son mentioned that even in the face of the apocalypse, Tagomi continued to drown himself in alcohol, revealing that this world's Tagomi was a drunkard. Suddenly, a baby's cries erupted from another room, and a woman emerged holding the child. It was Juliana, who was married to Tagomi's son in this parallel world. After some rest, Tagomi awoke to find many of his son's friends in the house. They were all anti-nuclear activists, preparing for a protest rally against nuclear weapons. In New York, Thomas received a letter from the government announcing he had been selected as one of the 10 outstanding members of the Hitler Youth to attend a month-long expedition in South America. Thomas was thrilled at the recognition, as only those deemed highly promising by the Empire were given such opportunities. However, John and Helen were horrified, knowing that if their son went to South America, his illness would eventually be discovered by the Empire. Helen immediately opposed the trip, causing Thomas to feel disappointed and unappreciated. Sensing the tension, John quickly intervened, suggesting they discuss the matter later. The gang found the site where the man in the high castle had burned the films, but discovered he had already left. They immediately used a phone booth to make a call. John received the information promptly, revealing his collaboration with the gang, who provided him with intelligence in exchange for money. At that moment, Helen approached John to discuss their son's trip to South America. John turned off the surveillance equipment before speaking. Helen was adamant about preventing Thomas from going, but John had a different plan. He believed Thomas should go, but had devised a way to handle his condition permanently. John's plan was for Thomas to be kidnapped by Jewish terrorists during an excursion in the South American hills. This would be publicly perceived as a terrorist attack on a high-ranking official, but it would be orchestrated by John himself. John planned to personally lead the search, ensuring Thomas's safety while publicly committing to never give up the search. In reality, Thomas would live out his days comfortably in South America, with no one knowing about his illness or finding him. Though reluctant to part with her son, Helen recognized this as the best option. John reassured her that perhaps one day they might reunite with Thomas. That evening, Thomas learned his parents had agreed to let him go to South America. Overjoyed, he hugged both his parents, leaving them with mixed emotions. They were happy for Thomas, but also saddened, knowing that once he left, it was uncertain when they might see him again. In the parallel world, Tagomi looked at this world's Juliana with a hint of joy on his face. Entering the house, he was delighted to see his grandson. This world, with a wife, son, and grandson, felt much warmer compared to his other lonely existence. However, his wife mentioned that their son didn't want him near the child. Tagomi was confused until he remembered that this world's version of him was an alcoholic, likely causing harm to the child while drunk, leading to his son's protective stance. Juliana noticed that Tagomi and his son were about to argue again and intervened by suggesting they go to the supermarket to buy some things. It was clear that Juliana was trying to create an opportunity for them to reconcile. At the supermarket, Tagomi saw people stockpiling goods due to the Cuban Missile Crisis, as if preparing for the end of the world. Meanwhile, the security officer found the man in the high castle's barn. According to witnesses, a group of Japanese had arrived at the location before them. Joe awoke in the morning and examined his father's wartime medals. After some hesitation, he donned a suit and picked up a Nazi armband, signaling his decision to stay and align with his father. In the parallel world, Tagomi's family watched President Kennedy's speech on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy spoke of entering a difficult and dangerous new era where the future was uncertain and the costs and casualties were unknown. He emphasized that their patience and will would be tested in the coming months. While threats and condemnations would alert them to dangers, the greatest danger lay in inaction. Their goal was not to conquer by force, but to win through virtue, not to sacrifice freedom for peace, but to achieve both peace and freedom within the hemisphere, hoping the world would follow suit. He ended with a prayer for their goals to be achieved. Joe decided to stay by his father's side. Meanwhile, Frank met with Gary to divide the explosives they had acquired into several bombs, planning to assassinate Japanese high officials, particularly the general, who had arrived recently. They sought Frank's and Sarah's help in identifying the best places to plant the bombs. Inspector Kido learned that the Japanese seen at the barn by witnesses were actually members of the gang. This finally provided evidence of the gang's collaboration with the Nazis, a situation Kido had long wanted to address. Ed and Frank completed the cufflinks, which were crucial for raising money to pay the gang. Failure to sell them on time would result in dire consequences from the gang. The pressure was now on Robert, who found a potential buyer. After a detailed explanation, the buyer was skeptical of the cufflinks' authenticity and hesitated. Sensing the buyer was about to leave, Ed quickly improvised a convincing story, leaving the buyer intrigued and ultimately deciding to purchase the cufflinks. Robert, witnessing Ed's impromptu salesmanship, recognized Ed's remarkable talent for selling. In New York, John and Helen attended the memorial service for the doctor. Juliana was also present as a citizen of the Reich. The host invited John to speak, and he delivered a poignant eulogy that the strength of a person depends on those around him, the community he serves and the family he protects. All his power stems from these people, and for them, he must be ready to give everything. Though ostensibly about the doctor, John was really speaking about his own family. He was willing to go to any lengths, even sacrificing his life to protect them. Among the many listeners, only his wife truly understood the depth of John's words. After the service, as people began to leave, Juliana walked with Thomas. Suddenly, Thomas froze, his eyes rolling back as he started having a seizure. Juliana, realizing something was wrong, quickly held him. Thomas soon regained consciousness, and Helen, fearing others might see, hurriedly took her sick son away. After selling the cufflinks, Ed and Robert prepared to deliver the money to the gang. Robert expressed confusion that it's Frank who got them into this mess, so he should be the one dealing with the gang who might get mad if things go south. Ed insisted he would go himself because he didn't want to risk anyone else. Robert, recognizing Ed's integrity, agreed to accompany him. Meanwhile, Frank and Sarah, disguised as bun vendors, staked out a Japanese grain warehouse to track the Japanese general's movements. Frank was puzzled by the heavily guarded grain warehouse and why the general came here every day. He noticed a worker's badge and moved closer to inspect it, prompting a Japanese soldier on the roof to aim a machine gun at him. Sarah intervened just in time, defusing the situation. Back at their base, Gary was furious, saying that their mission was to observe the general and Frank nearly blew it. Frank explained that those badges are radiation indicators. Given the general's daily visits, this place is significant. He suspected that they're building an atomic bomb. Gary was skeptical, asking him how he could be sure from a badge. Frank replied that the lost film not only showed his execution, but also depicted San Francisco being obliterated by an atomic bomb. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Gary and the others understood that if the Nazis discovered Japan's atomic bomb project, they would destroy the city. Ed and Robert arrived at the gang's hideout to deliver the money. Suddenly, the Kempeitai raided the place, locking them in a room. The gang boss, oblivious, continued his bravado until Inspector Kido presented a burnt reel found at the barn. The boss feigned ignorance, but Kido, deeming him a traitor to the Empire, shot him dead without mercy. The other gang members were also executed. Kiddo then noticed Ed and Robert, recognizing Ed as his informant, and let them go. In New York, Helen told John about their son's seizure, increasing his urgency to send Thomas to South America. Meanwhile, the doctor's widow expressed doubts about her husband's sudden death, suspecting foul play. She insisted on an autopsy. John, trying to calm her, escorted her home. Helen was growing more anxious and asked Juliana to stay. Sensing Helen's unease, Juliana reassured her that she only saw an overworked good boy. Helen was somewhat comforted by Juliana's words, feeling a bit of her worry ease. Following the death of the gang boss, Ed and Robert celebrated their newfound freedom, as they no longer had to make periodic payments. When Frank returned and heard the news, he was indifferent. His mind was preoccupied with other matters. That evening, the powerful politician Himmler called John from Berlin, informing him that Hitler was critically ill and the situation was grim. Himmler asked for John's support if Hitler died, to which John agreed. Realizing that a power struggle would soon erupt in Berlin, John hung up. Curious, his wife asked about the call, and John explained that Hitler was gravely ill. He speculated that Berlin wouldn't publicly disclose Hitler's condition for now. He emphasized to Helen the urgency of preparing their son for departure. Despite the tough circumstances, John reassured her that they could get through it. In the parallel world, Tagomi was fixing a cup he had previously shattered. He asked Juliana what he had done to make his son resent him so much. Juliana explained that this world's Tagomi disapproved of his son marrying an American woman, which had frightened his grandson. Given the historical enmity between Japan and America during World War II, Tagomi, a former soldier, found it difficult to accept an American daughter-in-law. In Berlin, Joe and his father Martin were having a casual conversation over dinner. Suddenly, several Nazi soldiers arrived and urgently escorted Martin to Hitler's office. Joe waited outside, growing increasingly anxious as time passed. Eventually, the soldiers brought Joe into the office, where Martin revealed that Hitler was critically ill and had appointed him as acting chancellor. Joe was puzzled, asking his father why Hitler would choose him since he was just an engineer. Martin explained that his non-threatening nature made him an ideal choice, unlike Himmler and others who would kill for power, leading to chaos. Martin then told Joe that Berlin was no longer safe and instructed him to return to New York. John found Juliana and confronted her to stop pretending, saying she had met the man in the high castle. Juliana admitted she had met the film producer briefly and had been drugged, but she didn't know his whereabouts. John wanted to know what was in the film she had seen. Juliana then recounted the film's contents to John. In San Francisco, Inspector Kido learned that the German diplomat wanted to meet the Japanese general. The diplomat intended to defect to Japan. Helen received a call from John, informing her that Martin had been promoted to acting chancellor, changing their plans. Thomas's trip to South America would be delayed. While visiting Helen, Juliana and a lady discussed the doctor's wife, revealing that they had refused her request for an autopsy and had cremated the doctor's body without informing her. The lady, whose husband is the Minister of Information, turned on the TV, noting that it would broadcast only old footage of Hitler all day, with no new updates. Helen sternly reprimanded the lady that saying such things is treason. Frightened, Juliana and the lady quickly left. John received news that the German diplomat had defected to Japan. To verify the information, he called Inspector Kido, who confirmed that not only had the diplomat defected, but he also brought conclusive evidence of a Nazi plot to assassinate the Crown Prince, implicating the high-ranking German Nazi official Heydrich. This conspiracy aimed to incite a war between Germany and Japan. John warned Kido that his next actions might label him a traitor. Kido, however, was willing to bear all consequences, emphasizing their mutual agreement to work together for the benefit of both nations. John offered Kido protection, but Kido declined, stating his loyalty was to his country, not personal gain. On the other side, George introduced Juliana to the female leader of the New York resistance. Juliana mentioned that Hitler was near death. The leader simply responded, "It's time," and walked away, leaving Juliana confused. George explained that Hitler's death would signal the moment for an uprising. Juliana then realized that the events in the film she had seen might be unfolding because of her actions. She called her stepfather, urging him to leave San Francisco, and also notified Ed and Frank to leave. Juliana's stepfather immediately found Frank and told him about Hitler's imminent death and the impending uprising, which could lead to the city's destruction. Frank, believing Juliana was with Joe and holding a grudge, accused her of lying. Frustrated, Juliana's stepfather admonished Frank for doubting Juliana's sincerity and walked away. Angry, Frank confronted Gary, accusing him and the others of knowing Juliana was alive and working with the resistance without informing him. Gary admitted they were using Juliana for as long as she was useful, and once she wasn't, she would face consequences. He implored Frank to put aside personal feelings. In the parallel world, Tagomi had a heartfelt conversation with his son over dinner, asking about his relationship with Juliana. This open discussion helped mend their strained relationship. The next day, Tagomi gave his son the repaired cup as a gesture of reconciliation. His son accepted the apology, allowing Tagomi to reconnect with his grandson. Joe did not return to New York, but instead went to Hitler's office to see Martin, insisting on staying with his father. Meanwhile, John visited Heydrich in prison, treating him with uncharacteristic courtesy. He had his men bring Heydrich's commander's uniform. John informed Heydrich that San Francisco had been leveled by an atomic bomb and that they were invading Japan. Berlin demanded Heydrich's immediate release, and John pleaded for mercy for his family. Heydrich, sensing his victory, smugly remarked that Hitler must be dead and a new Führer had taken over. When John asked for assurance that his family would be spared, Heydrich deferred to the new Führer. John probed further if he is the new Führer, but Heydrich denied it, saying it's someone with a broader vision. Long live Martin Heisman! It turned out that this was all part of John's elaborate trap. Heydrich fell for it, revealing the mastermind behind the conspiracy of triggering a war between Japan and Germany. John then decisively killed Heydrich. This cunning move demonstrated John's intelligence and insight. Through his conversation with Juliana, he learned about San Francisco's destruction by an atomic bomb and understood that the film's content might depict future events. He used this knowledge to deceive Heydrich and uncover the true villain. With Hitler's last breath, the ultimate schemer, Martin, ascended to the pinnacle of power. In his home in the parallel world, Tagomi watched a film showing the explosion of a hydrogen bomb. The film, provided by an old journalist friend of his son, depicted a bomb thousands of times more powerful than the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The United States had conducted this public test to intimidate the Soviet Union. Witnessing the devastating power of the bomb, Tagomi was stunned and collapsed into his chair. Meanwhile, Juliana and George used the Minister of Information's wife to blackmail her husband. The resistance demanded the minister announce Hitler's death on television to incite public panic and aid their uprising. After making the announcement, he was immediately shot. In return, the resistance promised to send Juliana to a neutral zone. In San Francisco, the resistance planned to assassinate the Japanese general and Kido with a bomb. Frank volunteered to plant it, seeking personal revenge as Kido had gassed his sister and nephew to death. That evening, Martin announced Hitler's death to the world, claiming that medical examinations revealed rare syphilis in Hitler's body, confirming that he had been murdered by the Japanese. Martin framed this as an act of war, declaring that Germany would retaliate against Japan. At home, Juliana watched Martin's broadcast. Just as she turned off the TV, Thomas arrived, seeking answers about his collapse during the memorial service. His parents had been evasive, so he turned to Juliana. Juliana, unaware of the details, tried to comfort him, suggesting he talk to his parents. Thomas had already researched his symptoms at the library and suspected he had a terminal illness, which would make him a candidate for extermination under the law. As he grew increasingly distressed, Juliana managed to calm him down and send him home, although Nazi soldiers were monitoring the entire exchange. Kido, who had always strived to maintain peace between Germany and Japan, now felt his efforts were in vain. In his despair, the general approached him, explaining that the German diplomat's assassination of the Crown Prince was a deliberate provocation to start a war. Failing to incite Japan with the initial plot, the Germans fabricated a new lie, accusing Japanese agents of killing their Führer, Hitler. War was now inevitable, and San Francisco would be the first target. In the parallel world, the Soviet Union had withdrawn, resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tagomi was reluctant to leave his family, knowing he had a mission to prevent the war between Germany and Japan. He bid farewell to his family, his wife smoothing his collar as a gesture of forgiveness. He then asked Juliana for the film of the hydrogen bomb explosion, stating that such events should never happen. He assured her they would meet again. Tagomi returned to his world with the film in hand. Ed and Robert were preparing to head to the neutral zone, having divided the money from selling cufflinks into 3 shares. Frank refused his share, giving it to Ed instead. Ed tried to decline, but Frank, determined to bomb the Japanese building, insisted he had no use for the money anymore. Upon his return from the parallel world, Tagomi discovered that his subordinate was also a traveler from another world. The burn on his wrist was from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The man recounted how his family in the other world all perished in a nuclear explosion, and he had slowly recovered from his burns in the hospital. He learned to cope with the physical and emotional scars, accidentally crossing into this world where he found his family still alive and happy. Tagomi believed there was a reason for his ability to cross worlds. Having witnessed the devastating power of the hydrogen bomb, he wanted to meet the crown prince to prevent the Japanese general from starting a war. The subordinate informed Tagomi about recent events. Hitler had been poisoned, the Nazis blamed Japan, and war was imminent. Hearing this, Tagomi took the film and went to find Inspector Kido. In New York, John was organizing efforts to suppress the resistance uprising. His surveillance team reported that Thomas had visited Juliana. John reviewed the surveillance footage, confirmed that no one else had seen it, and ordered his men to keep it confidential before taking the tape himself. The resistance in San Francisco equipped a car with a bomb, with Frank and Sarah set to carry out the mission. Frank would drive and Sarah would pose as the general's mistress. As they approached the building, Japanese soldiers stopped them to check their travel documents. When it seemed they might be exposed, Frank prepared to press the detonation button. However, Sarah threatened the soldier, saying the general would punish him if she was not allowed entry. They were then allowed to pass. Inside, the general was delivering a speech, preparing for war with Germany. He warned that everyone in the room might not survive until sunrise, but their descendants would live on. Frank and Sarah drove the car into the basement, planted the bomb, and quickly left. Tagomi was also rushing to meet Kido. As Frank and Sarah exited the basement, Kido was on his way to meet Tagomi and spotted them. With the bomb about to explode, Frank resigned to his fate, drew his gun, and shot at Kido. The building exploded, but Kido miraculously survived. Meanwhile, Ed and Robert, on a bus to the neutral zone, saw the explosion and reminisced about their good times with Frank and Juliana. The bombing caused numerous casualties, including high-ranking officials above Kido and his deputy. Tagomi arrived, and he and Kido exchanged a heavy, knowing look. Resistance uprisings erupted in the American Reich. The commander from Berlin declared Japan the top enemy and suggested using atomic bombs on the most rebellious cities to set an example. John, having witnessed the power of atomic bombs, was reluctant to follow this directive. Tagomi showed Kido the film from the parallel world. Shocked, Kido insisted Japan did not have such technology, but the explosion's location was clearly on Japanese soil. Tagomi hoped to show the film to German leaders, making them believe Japan had nuclear capabilities, which might deter them from attacking. Meanwhile, in Berlin, high-ranking Nazi officers were planning an attack on Japan. The first phase involved using submarines and land-based missiles to destroy major Japanese cities within just 15 minutes. Tokyo, however, was excluded from the initial targets because the Nazis wanted the Japanese to witness their emperor's surrender, proving that Germans were the superior race. Martin disagreed, arguing that even without the emperor, the Japanese would recognize their inferiority, and insisted on including Tokyo in the attack. The second phase involved using long-range nuclear bombers to destroy secondary cities within 6 hours. The third phase was a ground invasion, aiming to occupy all of Japan within 2 weeks. The ultimate goal was a world with only one nation, Germany. The nuclear attacks were expected to kill 15 million Japanese people. Given Japan's reliance on conventional weapons, the damage to Germany would be minimal, affecting only a few 100,000, mostly Americans. This plan was quickly approved by the senior German officers. After the meeting, Joe appeared horrified, believing that starting a war to kill so many people was inhumane. Martin argued that global unification would bring permanent peace and create a better world. Meanwhile, Thomas was at home, sifting through numerous books. He realized something was wrong and suspected his parents' agreement to let him go to South America was part of a larger scheme. John, seeing he couldn't hide the truth any longer, decided to tell his son everything, reassuring him that it didn't mean he couldn't be happy. At the same time, Kido's unauthorized entry into Germany was discovered by John. Juliana approached George, hoping he would fulfill his promise to send her to the neutral zone. George refused, accusing her of not reporting her conversation with Thomas. He then produced a film reel, stating it was the bullet that could kill John. If the film was handed over to the Germans, the Nazis would execute John for concealing his son's illness. However, Juliana saw Thomas as a good kid and knew this would also lead to his death. George then suggested taking Juliana to prepare for their departure. At that moment, the female resistance leader arrived with a photo of Karen, vowing to kill Juliana to avenge their lost member. After a struggle, Juliana managed to kill both attackers and walked out to find George, who had just donned a Nazi uniform. Juliana pointed a gun at George, demanding the film. George argued that to defeat the Nazis, they had to be worse than them, refusing to hand it over. Juliana chose to kill George to save Thomas, shooting him in the street. This scene was exactly as depicted in the film, and only this timeline's San Francisco would be spared from nuclear destruction. John watched the film Kido brought, and Kido explained that Japan had not assassinated Hitler. The two countries would go to war over a lie, making Heydrich and his conspirators the only winners and failing their duty to protect their nations. After some thought, John decided to show the film to Martin to prove Japan had nuclear weapons, hoping to deter him from launching an attack. Kido then prepared to return to the embassy. John arrived in Berlin and immediately visited Joe, urging him to show the film to his father, the Nazi new leader Martin. He warned that if they didn't help, New York would be leveled, resulting in countless deaths. Joe agreed to help and took John to see Martin. Upon watching the film, the group was visibly shaken. Martin, however, believed they still had the upper hand and insisted on proceeding with the attack. John then handed Himmler a document containing Heydrich's confession, revealing that their new leader, Martin, was the mastermind behind the plot, including the murder of the Japanese crown prince and poisoning Hitler. At that moment, Martin was about to press the button to launch the nuclear strike, while Joe pleaded with his father to reconsider. Himmler arrived with John and his men to arrest Martin, charging him with treason and the murder of Hitler. Joe realized he had been outmaneuvered by John once again. After Martin's arrest, Himmler took over as the new Führer of Germany and ascended the podium with John, who was moved by the scene before him. Simultaneously, John's family watched his rise to power on television, filled with pride. Thomas's expression shifted from pride to melancholy, determined not to let his father down. He voluntarily disclosed his illness to the health department. Helen was shocked by this development. Thomas then told his mother that he wanted his father to be proud of him before being taken away by the health department. On the other side, Juliana burned the film of her conversation with Thomas. At that moment, she met the man in the high castle. He told her she always appears in the films, showing up at crucial moments, and the world revolves around her. No matter how things change around her, she remains constant. He added that because Juliana killed George and saved that Nazi child, San Francisco remains intact and millions of people are alive. Afterward, he took Juliana to meet another world's version of her half-sister, Trudy. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Lemuel, posing as Juliana's friend, delivered a box of films left behind by the man in the high castle to Tagomi, and here concludes Season 2 of this drama.